everyone, this is Kira Zeidelman from the NARUC offices in Washington, D.C. Welcome to the webinar on federal-state cooperation on pipeline safety. We're very excited to have some speakers from PHMSA and the National Association of Pipeline Safety Representatives to talk about this very important topic, of course, on the eve of National Dig Safely Day tomorrow. So just one quick housekeeping item. During the presentations, all of your lines will be muted. After our two presenters, the speakers will be available for questions, and you can submit questions in two ways using the GoToWebinar toolbar. You can either type your question into the questions box or select the hands icon to raise your hand, and I will unmute your phone line for you to ask your question. I also just wanted to thank Commissioner Fornstrom for moderating the discussion today, and Commissioner Berman for allowing us to take up the regular monthly Committee on Gas call time slot to discuss this topic. So with that, Commissioner Fornstrom, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Kira, for all your work on supporting this webinar. Welcome, everyone, to our webinar called Digging Safe Federal-State Cooperation on Pipeline Safety. We really appreciate you joining us on a Friday afternoon to discuss this important topic. I have a few preliminary remarks, and then I'll introduce our two speakers. As Kira said, excuse me, following the presentations, we hope to have some time for questions. So be marking those down as we go through this. National Dig Safely Day is tomorrow, August 11th, which reminds us of the importance of safe excavation practices. While it's important to have a national day, actually every day must be considered a safe digging day. The call before you dig law applies at all times to everyone. Every 6 minutes, an underground utility line is damaged because someone didn't call 811 at least 2 business days before digging. Many efforts have been made to limit or prevent excavator damage. Certainly one of the major milestones in this effort was PHMSA's adoption of a final rule to establish the process for evaluating state excavation damage prevention law enforcement programs. Our first speaker is Sam Hall, who's a senior program manager for PHMSA, supporting a variety of PHMSA's damage prevention, emergency response, and public awareness initiatives. He was the primary author of the Excavation Damage Prevention Law Enforcement Rulemaking and is leading the implementation of this rule. He has also managed PHMSA's state damage prevention grants and technical assistant grants programs, and he oversees PHMSA's cooperative agreement with the Common Ground Alliance. Sam's going to start today and will provide an overview of PHMSA's final rule on excavation damage prevention law enforcement and how PHMSA determines state adequacy. Following Sam will be our second speaker, Jason Montoya, who has served as the Pipeline Safety Bureau Chief at the New Mexico Commission since 2010. He graduated from New Mexico State University in 2000 with a bachelor's degree in civil engineering and currently holds professional engineering licenses in New Mexico, Arizona, and Texas. We wanted him to be part of this webinar because he's currently serving as the National Chair for NAPSR. Jason is a qualified pipeline and hazardous materials safety administration Category 1 inspector. He's provided several deposition and testimonies as a New Mexico excavation law expert witness, and his area of expertise is in damage prevention and utility coordination. Today, Jason is going to provide the state perspective on implementing the new rule, obtaining and maintaining adequacy, and other efforts to work closely with the federal government to improve pipeline safety. With those introductions, I'm going to turn it over to Sam to give us the overview of the rule.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak with you today. As the Commissioner mentioned, I'll be talking about the final rule. Kira, next slide, please. I want to take just a moment to review the rule. The rule came out of the Pipes Act of 2006. Which is the Pipeline Inspection, Protection, Enforcement, and Safety Act of 2006. And the law said it gave PHMSA new enforcement authority over excavators. Now, that's an enforcement authority that we at PHMSA never had in the past. We were given this authority on a very limited basis. And specifically, the law said that we could only enforce against excavators who unlawfully damaged underground pipelines in states that do not adequately enforce their own laws. Our task after receiving that authority through the Pipes Act was to develop a regulation that would define how we would determine the adequacy of state one-call law enforcement programs as well as how we would enforce the regulation and what provisions we would specifically enforce. Our goal with the rule is to encourage states to enforce their own damage prevention laws. We've said that very clearly in the rule itself, and we've been saying that since the rule came into effect in January 1st of 2016. Again, we want the states to enforce their own damage prevention laws, and if we fail to achieve that goal, we've really failed to meet the letter and intent of the law itself. The rule has two major parts. That's the two bullets in the middle of the slide. The first primary part defines how we will evaluate state damage prevention law enforcement programs. And we outline 7 criteria for evaluating the adequacy of law enforcement programs, again, with the intent to only be able to enforce against excavators in states that have inadequate law enforcement programs. The second part, the third bullet here, defines the federal safety standard that is applicable to excavators who are digging near pipelines. That is what excavators are required to do under federal regulation in states that do not adequately enforce their own one-call laws. Again, last point, we only have authority over excavators in states that are deemed inadequate. If a state has an adequate program, then we have absolutely no jurisdiction over excavators in that state. Next slide, please. Some quick comments about what the rule is not. It is not an attempt to create a national one-call law, and it is not a takeover of state damage prevention programs. And on that point in particular, I'd like to say that if and when we deem a state's enforcement program to be inadequate, we are not taking away the state's authority to enforce its own one-call law. In fact, we would not want to do that in the least. We are hoping that states will enforce their own one-call laws. So a determination of inadequacy by PHMSA for a state does not mean that the state cannot continue to enforce its own damage prevention laws and pursue improvements in damage prevention. We do not nullify state damage prevention laws, and we are not taking over state programs. There's been some misconception that we're taking over the one call in states, which is absolutely not true, or that we are suddenly the new sheriff in town, and that is also not true. We are hoping that states will enforce their own one-call laws, and we at PHMSA then will act as a backstop at federal enforcement authority in an instance of unlawful excavation damage to a pipeline. Lastly, it is not an attempt to establish a large federal enforcement regime. In fact, if we do establish a large federal enforcement regime, we have failed. We're trying to work ourselves out of a job with this rule by driving the states to enforce their own one-call laws. Next slide. I wanted to briefly mention some resources, simply a web page that I'd like you to review if you're interested in more information. Because I've got limited time today, I don't have a lot of time to go into the background of the rule, but our website here does provide some good resources for you. You can simply go to our website at phmsa.dot.gov and search on the terms excavation enforcement, and that will bring up a website with background information on the rule itself, to include some additional information that I'm not able to cover today. Our state program evaluations, our determinations of adequacy to date. We have the opportunity to complain to us about excavation damage that has occurred in a state that is inadequate. We have the text of the rule, some frequently asked questions, and then an important piece that may be of interest to you, we have the checklist that we use to evaluate the state law enforcement programs so that you can be familiar with how we are evaluating those states, the state programs. And then lastly, we have contact information for us at PHMSA. Next slide. This is a map of the results of our 2016 evaluations. Again, the law went into, or the rule, I should say, went into effect January 1st of 2016. And we got very busy then evaluating state programs. In fact, we visited personally every state in the union to include Alaska and Hawaii. and Washington, D.C. The only state we didn't visit in person, and of course it's not a state, but the only entity that we didn't visit is Puerto Rico, because at the time we were concerned about Zika virus and bringing that back to D.C. So we did that particular evaluation over the phone. The first round of evaluations in person was really remarkably good. We learned so much in working with the states and actually sitting down face to face with the primary damage prevention stakeholders in each state. We established good, strong relationships with each of the states. We got a very good understanding of how the states were operating. And in those states that we deemed inadequate, we had a very clear understanding of some of the deficiencies that the states were experiencing, and we learned a lot about how we could support the states. So you can see here, these were the results of 2016. We had 24 states that were deemed adequate, 27 states that were deemed inadequate, and one state at the time, North Carolina, contested our finding. We found them inadequate initially. They contested our finding, which is their right under the rule. And so you can see those results here. The next slide is the results from 2017. And as you can see, the states have really changed. They've really stepped up to the plate. As it stands today, we have 37 states that are adequate, 13 states that are inadequate, and 2 states that are currently contesting, Idaho and Louisiana. So, you know, the first year we saw a lot of red on the map. Over 50% of the states were deemed inadequate. And in 1 year, we were able to reduce the number of inadequate states to only 13. And we're confident that we will be reducing this number further over the next several years. So really very good results in a very short period of time. Next slide. Some general observations about our work in this. The first is that states have been extremely proactive about improving their one-call law enforcement programs, and they clearly want to have adequate enforcement programs. States have also been remarkably successful in a very short period of time, as I think is evidenced by the maps that you saw, and we wish to congratulate the states and thank them for their tremendous efforts in making improvements. The success of this program, the success of this rule is entirely credited to you, the states, for making the changes that you've made to have adequate enforcement programs of your one-call laws. So thank you and congratulations for that. We found that states are generally supportive of our approach to implementation of the rule. Certainly there have been some hiccups and some complaints and some frustrations that we have done our best to try to address. That would be, I'm sure, expected in any time you're implementing a new rule, and especially when you're implementing a rule with partners in damage prevention. But you know, generally our experience has been that the states have been very supportive of our approach. And lastly, we've helped many states advance their goals, and we will continue to assist in any way we can. We believe very strongly in using the carrot and not the stick. We believe very strongly in supporting our partners in improving their one-call law enforcement programs. We're in this together. We're partners in damage prevention. And of course, it being National Safe Digging Day tomorrow, that's a key theme of damage prevention, and that is partnership and working together. We stand ready to assist the states in any way that we can to improve their one-call law enforcement programs. Next slide. So quick thoughts on how to improve if your state's enforcement program is deemed inadequate. I mentioned that we have a checklist and associated guidance out on our website. That checklist is what we use to evaluate state enforcement programs, and it can be used as a roadmap to make improvements. We will also offer support in any way that we can, and I've listed some things that we do to support the states. We've written multiple letters of support for new legislation or for improvements to processes at the state level. We've reviewed proposed legislation. Many times the authors of legislation have reached out to us and said, is this clause going to satisfy the requirements of the PIPES Act in this final rule? We're happy to review proposed legislation, proposed language, proposed approaches to improvement. We're happy to have conversations, anything that we can do to support that. And then lastly, education of stakeholders. We have spoken to one-call board meetings. We have sat down with state senators and state representatives in multiple states. We have spoken at conferences, damage prevention conferences, any place that we are needed and wanted. We do our level best to come out and educate stakeholders, especially in the beginning of this program when there were many, many misconceptions about what it was that we were doing. There were some fears and concerns about overreach of the federal government and what was really going to be expected of the states. And we have consistently tried to be a partner in educating stakeholders and be a voice of authority and truth when it comes to what the rule says and what it does not say. So we stand ready to support. Next slide, please. Some quick thoughts on our approach to federal enforcement. As I mentioned, we only have enforcement authority in states that have inadequate enforcement programs. So right now that's 13 states with 2 contesting. And that's really, that diminished our enforcement authority quite a bit from the year before when we had 27 states that were inadequate. So we're accomplishing our goal of limiting our authority over excavators. Now that said, when we become aware of an excavation damage that occurs in a state that we have deemed to be inadequate, we have some processes internally that help us determine when and how we will undertake enforcement. Essentially, our philosophy is that our enforcement activity is strategic and targeted and to be used on a very limited basis. Again, our authority should be considered backstop, not primary. We do not have the resources to take over enforcement in a state or to establish a strong federal enforcement regime in any given state. We rely on the states to do that. So the kinds of cases where we would be interested in enforcing would be cases of very severe cases of excavation damage, either with fatalities, severe injuries, significant property damage, or those instances where those things could have very easily happened. A tragedy could have very easily resulted. So, for example, if an excavator were to unlawfully damage a pipeline in front of a school during school hours without a dig ticket, even if there were no injuries, fatalities, or property damage, we would take that very, very seriously and be very concerned about improving the excavator behavior in the state. Our primary goal, again, is to encourage the state to enforce their own laws. So really, we're encouraging change in state behavior, not in necessarily excavator behavior. We want states to encourage change in excavator behavior by enforcing their own laws. Again, we don't have the resources to go after every minor damage or every minor infraction of the law. The third bullet here is that we will only, and we can only enforce our code, 49 Code of Federal Regulations, Part 196, which defines what excavators shall do in states that are deemed inadequate. We cannot enforce state laws. We do not have that authority, so we can only enforce our own regulations. And if you read 49 CFR Part 196, you'll see that it is rather nebulous. It essentially says, call before you dig, wait for the marks, respect the marks as you excavate, and then excavate with proper care. And that's, if you're familiar with state damage prevention laws, you'll know that that's not nearly specific enough to help excavators understand what their responsibilities are. So in a case where we decide that we want to pursue enforcement in an excavation damage case, we would take the state law into account very strongly. We can't enforce the state law. We can enforce Part 196. But if the state law says that, for example, the waiting period for, after you call is 2 days, then we would take that into account. We don't want to establish arbitrary timelines or arbitrary requirements that excavators at the state level would not understand or would not be aware of. We don't want to put excavators in double jeopardy, and we don't want to set up a quote-unquote gotcha situation where excavators don't know what they're required to do. Bottom line is excavators are required to follow the state law. If they unlawfully damage a pipeline and that in a state that is deemed inadequate, and we decide that we want to go after that excavator to improve safety, we would be very cognizant of what the state damage prevention law says to avoid double jeopardy for the excavator. And in any case, no matter what, our first line of action would be to go directly to the state and say, this is a case where we're very concerned. Are you able to enforce in this case? Can you use the authority that you have to begin to establish an adequate enforcement program? And if the answer to that question is yes, and the state can in fact enforce, then we would encourage the state to do that, and we would take a back seat. Again, we want the states to enforce their own laws. We do not want to take a heavy-handed approach and act like a new sheriff in town. Next slide, please. That's it. My telephone number is here, 804-556-4678. You can also reach me at sam.hall@dot.gov, and I'll be happy to discuss this with you in more detail if you'd like. Thank you.
Thank you, Sam. Jason, are you still on the line with us?
I am.
All right. Well, I have your slides pulled up. Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity. You can go into the next slide, and I appreciate Sam's presentation. It's a good segue into this first slide. And what I have in front of you are some key elements to a proactive and effective damage prevention program. Obviously, one of the questionnaires on the checklist that Sam referenced is that you have to have effective laws and regulations. You have to educate stakeholders and build public awareness. You have to effectively enforce those rules, your state rules, and you also have to work towards industry compliance. And this is for a state program. And what I'd like to have people think about is at the beginning, you probably have a reactive type program. And over time, as you continue to build better and more effective laws and regulations, you now move into a proactive stage or phase. And I'm kind of borrowing this phase approach from PHMSA and their strategic plan. And eventually you want to get into just an ultimate preventing underground facility damages during excavation activities over time. And so these are just key elements into a damage prevention program. The sub-elements can be categorized into any one of these. And sometimes we struggle with, do we educate stakeholders prior to public awareness, or do we enforce before we get industry compliance, or do we require industry compliance before effective enforcement? So those two bullet points can go in any one order as you see fit, but wanted to share that with you as well. The next slide. And this next slide is specific to New Mexico, but locally each state's going to have their own associations. But it's extremely important, as you saw from my first slide, is uniting the industry. Everywhere we go, we all talk about damage prevention being a shared responsibility. So we really need to unite the industry. PSB stands for the Pipeline Safety Bureau. That's our damage prevention program here in New Mexico. And then you can see the number of stakeholders that are involved with developing a robust damage prevention program. So there's a lot of legwork into establishing these working relationships. And I have to mention, our industry is losing a lot of seasoned veterans to retirement, budget cuts, sometimes better paying jobs, which have a negative impact on us, and that'll be around for a while because of the lost knowledge and or experience. This means it's even more important that facility owners and operators across the states have a state-of-the-art mapping system and information about the location of their facilities. And through these associations and these key stakeholders, I think that needs to be expressed across the board. Next slide. And so as we work towards uniting the industry, and develop stakeholder relationships and building public awareness, our ultimate achievement goal increases with those two categories. When I say we, referring to the industry and stakeholders, we kind of control our own destiny. And we always ask ourselves, where do we want to go with damage prevention and how do we get there? And these are two components that can help strive towards a zero damage mentality. Next slide. So what's missing from this slide, I know you see me have a strikeout on you, and for whatever reason, I put the word we in there instead of you. And we really cannot not afford to communicate. Communication is key amongst most of these stakeholders, and it's important that we engage everybody when you do develop rulemakings or develop new rules to what actually works within each state. Next slide. So my message to all the stakeholders, if each one of these icons represents a stakeholder group, is to really support your damage prevention initiatives versus your individual or your company's interest. If we want to reach that 90% goal or 100% goal from the previous slide, interest of preventing underground utility damage must supersede the interest of individuals, companies, or even those bottom line numbers, honestly. We need to know and understand the damage prevention rules and regulations locally. We need to understand what are the best practices nationally that you can take into consideration for proposed rulemakings or what have you. And each of us represents your damage prevention community. And so my message to everybody is to represent it in a positive and professional manner. And next slide. And these acronyms, PSB again is here locally, so you can put whatever state you're in with the one-call center or your one-call advocates and industry compliance. We can ultimately reach that target in all of this effort. So next slide. A great phrase, you know, just again, under damage prevention, don't be afraid to make mistakes. We got to be afraid of not learning from them. Damages are going to happen. With the amount of infrastructure that we have in the ground, especially in the telecommunications industry, a lot of lines are being abandoned, a lot of lines are unmapped. There's a lot of acquisitions and taking place in the natural gas and oil industry, especially here in the Permian Basin. And so things are going to happen. And as long as we can learn from them, we can hopefully prevent recurrence and prevent catastrophic events. Next slide. As part of the damage prevention industry nationwide, the next few slides are just some information sharing slides. And this is a survey. It's probably a few years old now. Sam could actually probably speak better to when the survey was taking place. But it's eye-catching that 811 has now been around over 10 years. And we still have half of American homeowners that plan to dig in an upcoming year, whether it's a garden, a fence, if it's ranchers, farmers, would not call 811. It's a free service, and if you go on to the next slide, and by simply calling that number, what we're trying to educate the community is you reduce the chance of causing a damage by less than 1%, just by simply calling, doing nothing else, doing no subsurface exploration, doing nothing more than simply calling and gaining knowledge of the whereabouts of what's below ground. You decrease your chances. And next slide. I think this next slide is a little outdated. I believe the number that's now being shared is 9 minutes. An underground utility line is damaged every 9 minutes. The takeaway for me when we publish something like this is we don't know which underground utility line is going to be damaged. We don't know if it's that buried service wire to a residential consumer. We don't know if it's the high pressure gathering line in the oil patch or gas patch. We don't know if it's a water infrastructure. So the scary thing is that every 9 minutes, you know, some type of underground facility is struck through excavation activities. So moving into the next slide, some initiatives and direction, basically some recommendations from a state's perspective is to establish effective enforcement. That's going to require staff's field time to gain knowledge of what the issues are during excavation activities. What are the areas that the enforcement needs to focus on? Is it not calling 811? Is it not waiting the 2 business days if that's what's applicable to your state? Is it excavators not respecting the locates within a certain tolerance zone? The other bullet point I have up there is closing out investigations. In New Mexico, we have a 30-day reporting period. So we're attempting to close investigations within that 30-day reporting period. Without that, you really can't gauge or trend where the improvement is needed. And so when you unite the industries through your local Common Ground Alliance or damage prevention summits or what you have in your state, that information is critical to dictate where your damage prevention program needs to go. And we really need to change behavior. In a lot of our compliance conferences and settlement agreements, I'm constantly telling people the old handshake out in the field is no longer valid, because when something happens, there's always three sides to every story, the excavator side, the utility side, and then the truth lies somewhere in between, and I'm always having to try and figure it out. So we really need to change the behavior, whether you're at fault or not. As an industry, we need to accept that we're trying to learn from those instances and events and prevent recurrence. Next slide. As Sam said, I took the time to say, at a very minimum, these are some things that every state should have. You should call 811 a minimum of 2 days prior to any surveying or excavating work. We've got to require those excavators to wait and allow an ample amount of time for the utility companies to accurately mark the horizontal distance of the underground facility. We should require everybody to verify that the utilities have been marked or cleared. And I have on here via positive response or whatever means and methods is a best fit for your program prior to excavation. And that's missing from that bullet point. I apologize. But it's important that they verify all utilities have been marked or cleared prior to commencing excavation. A lot of times people wait the 2 days, they call, they wait, and then they just proceed to dig after the 2 days has expired. And that has caused a lot of excavation damages. And of course, once you've exposed and identified the underground utility, protect it. Design your projects to remain a minimum of 18 inches is what I have on here, that can be filled in with 24 or whatever is a safe distance. And also provide and maintain offsets during your project. Obviously, during clearing and grubbing operations and excavation activity, a lot of the marks are disturbed or removed, and the excavator no longer has knowledge of its whereabouts. So it's important to have rules that require them to retain information about the underground utilities, and then report the damage to the underground facility owner and 811. I put 811 in there because the damage prevention program can then take action and do an investigation and determine what the potential root cause or what contributed to the damage that may be prevented in the future. And then, of course, protect the site. From any the general public, there's a lot of excavation going on in urban areas, so it's important for our contractors to understand and protect their site. The next few slides, you can go to the next one, is information that I wanted to share with everybody about the historic information gathered from pipeline operators. This slide is from the hazardous liquid industry, and you see the top three categories that are contributing to federally reported accidents over time. None of them are damage prevention. None of them are excavation. And so we've done a pretty good job in excavation on hazardous liquid pipelines. If you go to the next slide, I then focus on gas transmission. And now we have excavation damage tied in the top three, the lower third. But if you look back between 2016 and 17, we've decreased the total number of federally reported incidents from 10 to 2. Remarkable. A lot of that probably has to do with the new rules that the states that have become adequate are being effective. That's a very good measurement right there on itself. The next slide is distribution. On the left, you see excavation damage. Most distribution systems are in urban areas, your cities, your towns, your villages, your incorporated areas where most of the excavation activity takes place. So obviously your gas distribution systems are highly exposed to these excavation activities. Now, we have had an upward trend over the last few years, but now excavation seems to be headed in the right direction, and our areas of focus are more in the material weld, equipment failures, and incorrect operations. So again, if you go to the next slide now, in summary, Excavation damage is the top threat, but damage prevention programs appear to be effective. Even though your state has been deemed adequate or inadequate, even for those inadequate states, damage prevention programs are effective. We are now introducing safety management systems, and I know NARUC has had that discussion on the table before between among some of the committees, and that approach seems to be very helpful, where you're getting leadership within the organizations and the utility companies to buy into these damage prevention programs. Next slide. As I mentioned before, it's definitely a shared responsibility. We're all in it together. We all have to have the same mindset and the same goals that we want to achieve. I always speak on a zero damage mentality, because if you don't have it, you're never going to get there. And then the next slide, obviously is questions, I believe. Yeah. So just a little statement there. There's just a lot at stake. And even though the risk is calculated by consequence times the risk times consequences, I'm sorry, I'm getting tongue-tied here. It's too much at stake not to do the right thing for our communities and families. And so it's important that we get industry to buy in on the damage prevention programs. And as Sam said earlier, going from 27 to 13, that's remarkable. I applaud all those states that have done it. And I want to say it's been done within less than 1 year. And so risk is consequence times failure. So I apologize. In the distribution systems and the buried service wire to somebody's home may not have as much of a consequence, but it's equally important to protect that utility and service reliability that it is the gathering systems and the more rural underground infrastructure that exists. And so I'll leave it with that. So thank you.
Thank you, Jason and Sam. That was very helpful. I'll give everyone a minute to think of questions. And again, you can type those into the question box or raise your hands and I can unmute your line. I can see Commissioner Berman has her hand raised, but I don't think I can unmute you until you enter a PIN number. And I have a question from Commissioner Rendall. How do states handle enforcement of entities they do not have jurisdiction over? I think this could be for either of the speakers.
Could you repeat that question? Having states enforce over entities for which they have no jurisdiction?
Yeah, the question is, how do states handle enforcement of entities they do not have jurisdiction over?
Okay, I assume that the question is related to, I might be misassuming here, so if I am, I apologize, but we've gotten a lot of questions in the past about, well, we at the state only have authority over, say, natural gas distribution pipelines through our agreement with PHMSA. And transmission pipelines, we do not have authority over. We cannot regulate those operators of transmission pipelines. Of course, that arrangement will vary from state to state. My response to that would be that while the state may not have authority to enforce CFR 49 CFR Part 192 or Part 195, the state should have authority to enforce its own one-call law. The one-call law is what dictates our approach to this, not what the state can enforce with regard to pipeline safety. So typically a state one-call law will apply to every underground entity, whether that be a phone line, a sewer line, a water line, a transmission pipe, a distribution pipe. That law usually is silent on whether the pipeline itself is a transmission or a distribution line. Usually we have found that in some states, for example, Texas, the reason Texas's enforcement was inadequate was not because they don't enforce their law. It's because their law said that they didn't have enforcement authority under their one-call law over transmission pipelines. So that is, if an excavator were to damage a transmission pipeline in the state of Texas, no one had jurisdiction over that excavator. That's not unlawful, or that was not unlawful in the state of Texas until last year. Texas stepped up to the plate. They decided that their one-call law would cover every piece of underground infrastructure to include transmission pipelines, and after making that change, they were able to deal with excavators that damaged those pipelines, despite the fact that they weren't able to enforce Part 195 over certain elements of the pipeline infrastructure. So again, it's about who is jurisdictional to the one-call law, not to the pipeline regulatory structure in the state. And I hope that answers the question.
And Sam, I'll take it a step further and say...
I interject a little bit. This is Commissioner Rendall. I think the question, so in our one-call law, we had to create a safety committee that would have the ability to deal with violations for example, consumer-owned utilities and others who did not fall within our jurisdiction and did not want to come within this commission's jurisdiction to enforce the one call. So that was really more the issue is how do maybe state commissions handle the jurisdictional issue? And I'm just curious how other states have handled this. We had to create a separate entity that would handle those other non-jurisdictional folks. So I hope that clarifies my question.
Yes, Commissioner, this is Jason. Yeah, Sam, if I could elaborate a little bit more. Yeah, I think what most states are doing is drafting the one-call law to govern everything underground with the exclusion of any exemptions. Now, I'll take it a little step further than what Sam was referring to as far as 192, 195 pipelines. Commissions obviously have jurisdiction over setting rates for several facilities. And even though you have the jurisdiction over setting those rates, the one-call law doesn't only apply to them. It applies to everybody underground or that operates and maintains underground facilities. And that's the way New Mexico is, and it's my understanding that's the way it is in most states. And people that have exemptions have probably went to their legislature and removed those and have now been deemed adequate. So before they probably were inadequate, and I know there's a question about this. I think most of the states, and Sam, correct me if I'm wrong, but the 27 initially were deemed inadequate because of enforcement authority, primarily. And then they received enforcement authority, and then the second part was probably some exemptions exist, and when now those have been removed from the one-call law and apply to everything underground, all the infrastructure that could be at risk during excavation activities. And
yeah,
I hope
that is generally correct, Jason. The reasons that states were deemed inadequate really varied from state to state. Some states simply didn't have the authority to enforce their own law, and other states simply were not enforcing their law despite having the authority. In the case of an enforcement entity that simply didn't have jurisdiction over a set of excavators or a set of operators, the states have generally stepped up and changed their laws to correct those deficiencies. and remarkably within a year. I mean, it's just shocking how quickly these legislative fixes have been put into place. But we have seen many states establish separate independent enforcement boards for the one-call law. So specifically, Maryland has done that. West Virginia has now done that, and several other states have. And that was intended to fix these gaps in enforcement authority or gaps in jurisdiction in many cases. In some cases, states simply didn't have an enforcement authority established, and their approach was to establish an independent board that was given all the rights and jurisdiction necessary to adequately enforce the one-call law.
Thank you. Commissioner Berman. Sorry about that. Commissioner Sari? I believe Commissioner Sari's question is technology making the stake and locate function more reliable for vertical depth of underground facilities?
Can you repeat that?
Yes, the question is technology making the stake and locate function more reliable for vertical depth of underground facilities? And Commissioner Sari, I'll try and unmute you so that you can add some context if you'd like.
I'll take a shot at the question. I know that technology out there and available today for line locating services provides depth. However, most one-call rules or laws are silent on utility companies providing depth. It's typically a horizontal distance within the actual location of your underground facility. There are concerns about the accuracy of depth being provided by the instruments, obviously the deeper it goes. And so a lot of water lines, if you have a really deep pipeline of some sort, there's concerns with the accuracy of those depths. So most one-call laws are silent on requiring utility companies to provide depth. I personally think that it should at least be information provided to the excavator to have knowledge of its whereabouts, because if somebody is digging within a tolerance zone or a non-mechanical zone, how deep do they go before they call it quits and say, I don't need to be 10 feet deep, I'm going to install a new line at 3 feet. When do I stop digging to expose a facility that was marked? Where's it at? So there's discussion at the table about how do we address that. So I don't know if that really answers your question or kind of dodges it. Technology's there, it reads it, it presents itself, but there's concerns even from the line locating industry about its accuracy.
Jason, I'll add to that. There are some technologies out there that do help with this particular issue, and in particular, I'm talking about the marker ball technology. Some utility operators are burying small devices with their pipelines or their underground utilities that are machine readable, and as you pass an appropriate wand over the marker ball underground, you'll get a reading from that marker ball that shows the exact position of the pipeline, both horizontally and vertically, both X, Y, and Z. You can even get information on the operator's name, telephone number, and so on and so forth. So that is certainly a technology that is becoming more mainstream. There are other technologies that we fund through our R&D program. Inherently locatable plastic pipe is a technology that we've been funding over time. And that has good potential to help with depth as well. So those are a couple of examples of where technology is improving the depth reading and the ability to accurately locate using depth.
Sam. Actually, on that note, Commissioner Berman wanted to ask a question on how is PHMSA working with states on innovative ways to help dig safely evolve?
Sure. We've got a couple of approaches. The two primary ways that we do that are through two grant programs. One is our one-call grant program, which is a maximum of award of $45,000 to our NAPSR partners, so the state pipeline safety offices. And that money can be used for a variety of efforts to improve damage prevention and one-call operations, to include enforcement. The second is through our state damage prevention grants program, which is a $1.5 million grant program with a maximum award of $100,000. And that money can be used for a variety of things, to include improving partnerships, technology, enforcement, a variety of activities in the one-call world. And we are seeing results from that. In fact, we've been funding multiple states with enforcement dollars for several years. We've seen tremendous growth in some states by using these grant dollars. So those are really the two primary ways that we can fund important improvements in the one-call process and damage prevention world.
Thank you.
Yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry, go ahead, Kira.
Oh, I was just asking you if Commissioner Fornstrom had any questions that we haven't addressed yet.
I did have a question, but I think it's been answered in other questions, so I'm good.
All right, well, I think we've addressed everything that has come in, so I'd like to thank everyone for listening to the webinar, and thank, of course, Commissioner Fornstrom and Sam and Jason for speaking to us today. Of course, I think Sam included his contact information. These slides will be posted on NARUC's website, as well as the recording of the webinar, so you're welcome to share it with your colleagues and listen again if you are so inclined. So thanks very much, everyone. Have a great weekend and enjoy National Dig Safely Day tomorrow.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.